Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name's Andrew, and in this video we're going to be looking at one of the most interesting and controversial ethnic groups in the Russian Federation, the Cossacks. From their very inception, the Cossacks have been something of an enigma. Historically, they have been treated at different times as a class, a profession, and as an ethnic group. And it is due to this history that it is quite difficult to identify who is and is not a Cossack. It is worth noting that the Cossacks are not a uniquely Russian ethnic group. For many Ukrainians, their entire nation are the descendants of Cossacks, Zaporizhian Cossacks specifically. Furthermore, many of the Slavic community of Kazakhstan identify as Cossacks from either the Stimarachnoye, Orenburg, or other hosts. Even as far away as the United States, Australia and Canada all boast living, breathing Cossack communities of Don, Kuban, Terek and even Amur lineages. And who's to say they are wrong? Just like how one may be American and Irish, or British and Jamaican, it is entirely possible to be both Russian and a Cossack. In the Cossack community, there is an important distinction between Kazakhs or Cossacks in Ukrainian and Kazakchestva. Kazakhs or Cossacks are the descendants of genetic lineage of Cossacks, who once lived in one of the many hosts, whereas Kazakchestvas will wear Cossack attire, attend military parades, and even serve in the military forces, identifying as Cossacks, but do not have a definitive Cossack heritage themselves. This is something that prominently takes place in Russia, but also takes place in other nations, such as Belarus, which historically had very few Cossacks stationed there. The fluidity of Cossack identity has always been as much about a way of life as it has ever been about pedigree. And whilst there is some interesting internet discourse about exactly who is and is not a Cossack, it is my belief that self-identification is the most important factor. In their modern form, Cossacks are a Slavic ethnic group that can be found in Eastern Europe, primarily in Russia, but also in Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan in substantial numbers. Within Russia they have no republic, but can be found in large numbers in the Rostov Oblast, the Volgograd Oblast, Krasnodar Krai, and Moscow and the Moscow Oblast. Historically, Cossacks were a profession, then class, exclusively for men, but this has not stopped many women stepping forward and identifying with their own Cossack heritage. From official census data and records in both Ukraine and Russia, as well as further abroad, it is estimated there are around 120,000 self-identifying Cossacks worldwide. In the Russian Federation, in the last census, over 50,000 people stated their identity as Cossack, not Russian. The origins of the word Cossack are unclear, but there are two prominent theories as to where it has come from. The term is thought by some to derive from the word Kazakh, an old Turkic word meaning freeman or possibly adventurer. It denoted a man who was living outside of the tribal kinships of the steppes. And this does have some support from contextual writings of the Codex Cumanicus, a guidebook for Christian missionaries to interact with the pagan Cumans who were arriving in Europe in the 12th century. Another prominent theory is that the origin is indeed from a Turkic language, however derives from a different word. Kazakh, meaning as in to guard, suggests that the Cossacks were originally the patrolmen of the steppes against invaders from other tribes. Those eagle-eyed among you may have noticed the similarity in the Russian word for Cossack and Kazakh, the people of Kazakhstan. This is not an accident, and we will explore this link later in this video. Cossacks as an ethnic group do not have any sub-ethos groups, but historically were divided into different groups called voiska or host. Whilst these hosts may have been raised artificially later in their history, the first hosts that emerged within the Cossack community bore striking differences that was reflected in their clothing, attitudes and even language. Many of the Cossacks today claim a heritage from one of the many hosts that served in the Russian Empire. These links are often based on geography. For example, many in the Rostov Oblast claim a heritage from the Don Cossacks who historically resided there. However, others may claim a genuine pedigree. notably some Australian Cossacks drawing from the Emir host that ultimately fled to Australia in the 1920s. Ironically, the very nature of Cossack existence meant a lot of mixing, so to claim your heritage from one particular host is somewhat ironic. Most modern Cossacks speak Russian or Ukrainian, often both, with some of the wider community speaking English as their first language. The earliest mentions of Cossacks denote that the Tatar language was the primary means of communication, something not unusual in the 14th century. But later Slavisation of these groups led to other languages taking prominence. Interestingly, at least in the case of the Zaporizhian Cossacks, if not others, genuine translators were needed between their first meetings with the Russian state, as there was a significant language barrier. It should also be noted that during the Tsarist Empire before the Bolshevik Revolution, many dialects existed. In fact, the southern Russian dialect, which exists even today, is theorized to be influenced from extensive Cossack and Ukrainian influence. Whether there was a real language barrier with all the Cossack hosts cannot be known. What we do know is that at least by the 18th century, there were no reports of translators being needed, as all of the Cossack hosts spoke Russian. The Eurasian steppe has a long history of nomadic peoples inhabiting it. Scythians, Kipchaks, Khazars and Cumans all at different times roamed the grasslands, imprinting on each other and their neighbouring societies. The first written record of the Cossacks does not exist until the 14th century, but does not mean they did not exist before this time. As mentioned, the core term derives from the Turkic language, and in Central Asia, Cossack was a common term to describe wanderers, mercenaries and nomads. One theory holds that the Cossacks are themselves just the next wave of nomadic invaders, springing from the Tatar people left over after the Mongol invasions and peppered with a Slavic element, an element that increased over time. Another theory postulates that the Cossacks have existed in the region since the days of Kievan Rus, Slavic freebooters who would exist in the steppes free of oppressive Viking Rus authority. Early maps from the period show a clear demarcation of the principalities of the Rus, who often were fighting against nomads from the steppes. The steppes of both Ukraine and Russia are enormous, and both have and do nestle communities that have been far removed from the borders of civilization. It is worth noting that irrespective of when the Cossacks actually began to exist, their way of life was timeless. Trading, raiding, farming and fleeing had been a way of life in the steppe since time immemorial. Irrespective of the state of affairs before their arrival, the arrival of the Mongols in the 13th century changed the map. Nearly all the lands of eastern Ukraine and southern Russia were left empty, depopulated by fire and sword, a wild field as the area was later known. Whereas before there may have been herdsmen, freebooters or wandering nomads, now there was an emptiness that threatened civilization. With nothing to stand in their way, any raiders or invaders could cross the steppe and attack the richer cities in the north and the west. There was a perpetual lingering threat of invasion, but for the most time, nothing. Life in the Kievan Rus princedoms had always borne a degree of oppression, with a strict hierarchy enforced and taxes collected. As early as 1261, records from Ruthenian chronicles state Slavic peasants moving back into these empty lands for part of the year. This actually served a twofold purpose. Firstly, it allowed them to escape for part of the year the dues and obligations of their local lords. Given that such lords took not only wheat and silver, but also slaves from their own population to give to the Mongols, this was very appealing. Secondly, it gave men land to cultivate, to use for pasture, and to reap profit from them. These lands were not safe, hence why they were uninhabited, with frequent raids from Mongols and later Tatars occurring throughout the winter and the summer. Yet what was grown or raised here was that man's alone, and could make a fortunate man very rich in a short period of time. In the earliest records of Cossacks, many of the Cossacks listed on rosters actually have Tatar names. This has given rise to a theory that the Cossacks in origin were themselves Tatars. Over time, the Slavisation of the Cossacks occurred, and from a number of impetuses. Firstly, the Turkic base of the Cossacks may well have become mixed, not only from children from captured Slavic women, but also from a steady stream of Russian peasants pouring into the region. When the Mongols had invaded, the Slavic population had largely fled north. But as their own rulers began to demand more and more from their people to appease their Mongol overlords, many fled. The River Don was a popular route of escape. The Don started in the middle of Russia and flew all the way to the south. Many of the escaped serfs took this route and fell in with Tatar bands around the Don region. Links with the Tatar freebooters, or Cossacks, had been made since at least the 13th century, and multiple records show Cossacks assisting Russian princedoms against outside aggression for a price. Thus, the integration of these serfs into the Cossack lifestyle was not wholly foreign. By the 1450s, a significant Slavic presence was notable among the Cossacks. Whilst it would not be the last wave of serfs, a significant note is the Muscovite conquest of Novgorod in 1471, which sent many fleeing southwards to escape the oppressive Muscovite rule. It cannot be understated how mercenary and disunited the Cossackhood was in the early days. Whilst today we think of Cossacks as aligned with certain nations, they were, for the most part, entirely a force unto themselves. One of the translations of Cossack is freebooter, and I think this is a very fitting title. Important riverways, trade roads, and the open steppe were all inhabited by bands of Cossacks, who might rob and kill as easily as welcome and include newcomers. Whilst many Cossack bands sold their services and would trade as well as rob, those who lived in the steppe were forced into a far more martial way of life. By virtue of their position on the Don Basin, wedged between the fragmenting Khanates who relied on slavery to keep their own states prosperous, fighting became a way of life. To avoid becoming a slave, a Cossack had to learn how to ride and how to fight. Often small bands of Cossack would group together to prove too prickly to be easy pickings for the Khanates around them. They were not, however, a static force, and when numbers proved too overwhelming or a fight too hard, flight was the preferable option. This meant that the Cossacks, at least at this time, did not serve as a suitable deterrent to the slaving Khanates who would ride further north for richer trappings. As the number of Cossacks grew, they began to be recorded as living in the steppe year-round, as opposed to living part of the year in the various towns and settlements nearby. And it was also noted that their appetites had increased. Whether by origin or exposure, the Cossack looked very similar to the Tatar of the time, favouring oriental clothing, weaponry, and hit-and-run tactics. These, as they had done when the Mongols first implemented them in the 13th century, proved incredibly fruitful. In 1492, Khan Mendigarai wrote to the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Alexander Jagellon, complaining that his Cossacks had attacked Crimean ships. The Grand Duke replied, in effect, "What? Cossacks? They aren't my men, they raid me too!" This would become something of a theme in Cossack history, raiding everyone around them and confusing them as to who was exactly raiding them. Swelled with numbers and encouraged by their success, the 16th century would prove something of a golden age for the Cossack. Fleeing growing Muscovite control in 1520 with the annexation of the Princedom of Ryazan, the Cossacks there migrated further south to the Terek River. This would lay the groundwork for later Cossack development in the Caucasus region. It should be noted that the arrival of these Cossacks on the Terek coincides with the Circassian expansion, and it is largely thought that the Circassians made quite an impression on these Cossacks, who adopted many of the habits and, importantly, style of dress of their neighbours. In 1538, the Crimean Tatar fortress of Ochakiv in modern southwest Ukraine was torched by Cossack raiders who had sailed around the Black Sea coast. This was not their only raid that year. Sent a letter the following year to the Ottoman Sultan, reporting Cossack crimes and demanding he do something about them. The Sultan, fully aware this was not his doing, replied in effect of, "What? Cossacks? They aren't my men, they raid me too!" Funnily enough, a decade later, it would be the Sultan sending a message on pretty much the same topic, that he had been raided and asked the other to stop their men doing so. The reason both the Russians and the Turks thought that the Cossacks belonged to the other lies heavily with the fact that the Cossacks were a very unique people. Whilst early Cossacks may have been Tengriists or even possibly Muslims, by the 15th century orthodoxy was strong among the Cossack people. Whilst they dressed, rode and fought like Tatars, they practiced Christianity and largely spoke Slavic tongues. It is interesting to note that this change came from the mass demographic shift in Tatar society, the many Orthodox Slavic peasants arriving in their ranks, pretty much changing the core foundation of what the Cossacks once were. Yet to be a Cossack is to be mixed. And as we will see, this was not the case of all Cossacks hosts, many who had a very different and unique character. The second half of the 16th century would see a number of Cossack hosts emerge. The Don Cossacks along the Don River in 1549, the Zaporozhian Cossacks in 1552 along the Dnieper River, and the Terek Cossacks in 1577 near the Caucasus. Each host's creation was a genuine reaction to local needs and pressures. Yet among all three hosts that emerge in this time period, there are two commonalities: the need for security and the opportunity for plunder. Tatars, Russians, Turks, Lithuanians and Poles were all fair game for these wild men of the steppe, and more than one wise ruler saw the benefit of such people. The same year the Zaporozhian Cossacks settled on the island of Mala Khortytsa, Ivan IV, the first Tsar of Russia, recruited Cossacks to assist in the conquest of the Khanate of Kazan, followed 4 years later in the capture of Astrakhan. In 1572, the Polish king Sigismund II created the first official Cossack registry, a list of 500 Cossacks who were paid a monthly stipend even in times of peace. In return, they could be asked to raise their banners for the Polish king and keep their plunder as a reward. If that sounds like the Cossacks were now the subject of the Polish king, you are now mistaken. The Cossacks agreed to this registry because it was more like a contract. They were not obligated to do so, but there were great perks and benefits to raise their arms for the Polish king. Whilst the Cossacks were dangerous, they were also incredibly useful. Hardy, self-reliant and skilled with arms, they would be utilised in dozens of conflicts across Eastern Europe, with even distant rulers such as the King of Georgia using Cossacks in their campaigns. Yet perhaps one of the most iconic uses of the Cossacks was not so much as soldiers, but as colonisers. The Khanate of Kazan, Astrakhan and even Sibir were felled with heavy use of Cossack cavalry. Yermak Timofeyevich, a Cossack ataman and promyshelnik, spearheaded the Russian invasion of Siberia and would be immortalised in Russian history as the Cortez of the East. What most people don't realise is that Yermak was a Don Cossack, as were most of the 800 men who rode with him, riding at the behest of a Russian paymaster, Semyon Stroganov. It is worth remembering that at this point, the Cossacks were not truly a people yet, with families, songs and culture, but rather a hodgepodge of desperate men who fought for plunder and rewards. Yet they weren't exactly mercenaries either. Many of the contemporary records of the time record Cossacks in the same tone as pirates. After the fall of the Astrakhan Khanate, Russian governors of the region complained of Cossacks raiding the city from across the sea. As the Russian Empire expanded, the Volga became an artery of trade, and Cossacks who resided on there, opportunistically attacking ships, were forced out by the Russian army, many fleeing south and joining the Terek Cossack host. The relationship between the Russian state and Cossack would fluctuate dramatically, depending on the time of year, the economic incentive, and the host in question. There was no universal relationship because, for the large part, these were hundreds of small bands treating independently with one large state. The Cossacks of Zaporizhia began to treat more regularly with the expanding Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth towards the end of the 16th century. Their raiding lifestyle, often upon the richer Crimean Turks, caused friction between the Ottomans and the Poles. After a period of unrest, known as the Kozinski Uprising, the Zaporizhians nominally agreed to an oath of loyalty to the Polish crown. It should be noted that this was not a forced vassalage, more of a coerced agreement, and one that the Poles were reluctant to tread too heavily on. It is, however, significant, as for the first time, we see the Cossacks bound, at least nominally, to a foreign power. Throughout their history, the master would change, but again and again, Cossacks would be seen over. It also notes the first time that the Cossacks were seen not as a mercenary group or as a nuisance, but as a people, allowed to live and raise their families in peace in return for oaths of loyalty. The registered Cossacks now had to abide by the decrees from the Polish crown, at least on paper. For many Cossacks throughout the 17th century, both the north and the south provided great opportunities for them. Regular Cossack bands were recruited to assist the exploration and fur trapping of Siberia, bringing men from the Don, the Volga, the Terek and the Dnieper up through Muscovy and into the rich fur lands of Siberia. These expeditions were exactly that, expeditions. But from this time period we do begin to see Cossacks begin to settle down in the east. 1639 marks the year the first Cossacks overwinter in the Baikal region. These Siberian Cossacks would gradually be supplemented with Buryak and Evenk recruits. This also shows us the fluidity of Cossack life. Whereas in the Don and in Ukraine, orthodoxy was a must to become a Cossack, in the east, Buddhist and Tengrist Cossacks existed, living outside the law unto themselves. Cossacks would play instrumental roles in the nation building of both Russia and Poland. In 1606, 4,000 Cossacks from the Don region joined the first False Dmitry, who was supported by the Poles. In return for helping him take the Russian crown, they were rewarded with plunder and prestige. Similarly, Cossacks from the Polish registries were recruited into numerous wars in Eastern Europe. However, these powerful military assets were not for long allowed to roam free, and neighbouring powers were seeking ways of binding them into their own states. It should also be noted that the wild fields which had for so long been the playground of the Tatars were starting to become colonised by Slavic peoples from this period onward. Not just permanent Cossack stanitsas either, but new settlements from both Poland and Russia were beginning to be built on the wild fields. Whilst the Crimean Khanate was still a power and held vast lands here, their ability to devastate the lands had diminished since the 15th century, due to internal instability and more people beginning to settle the once desolated fields of eastern Ukraine and southern Russia. Since the Zaporizhians made their pledge of loyalty to the Polish crown, the Cossack registry had only expanded in small increments, meaning for most Cossacks, plunder was an important part of sustaining their way of life. Cossack society was not equal, and as with every society, there were those who were better off and those who were poorer. Many of the atamans were selected based on extensive property and held land. Poorer Cossacks and the many landless would work for the richer ones and supplement their meagre incomes with plunder and raiding. Cossacks not on the registry made up the majority in the Dnieper lands. These unregistered Cossacks rode out against the slaving Crimeans and sailed across the Black Sea to loot and pillage with due haste. Cossacks not on this registry and not receiving a stipend made up the majority. Between 1615 and 1623, Istanbul and its suburbs were raided 5 times, with neighbouring Trebizond and the Crimean slave capital of Kaffa both captured and torched. Throughout the 17th century, Polish authority was increasing, and many of the Polish nobility began to see the Cossacks not as co-belligerents, but rather vassals. This attitude, alongside many Polish abuses of Cossacks, had led to numerous small, disconnected revolts and uprisings across the century. The Polish Sejm, a council of noblemen, had significant power in the country, and used that power to veto many proposed wars against the Ottomans to the south. This had a disastrous effect for the Cossacks, whose raiding was an integral part of not only their lifestyle, but economic viability. Appeals from the Zaporizhians to expand the Cossack registry to allow more of them to receive a government stipend was refused by the Sejm. one of several sources of discontent. In addition to political and economic issues, there had been a religious divide with the Polish state as well. Since 1596, there had been a growing religious divide between the Cossacks and the Poles. Orthodoxy was the religion of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and the Treaty of Brest in 1596 surrendered the autonomy and power of the Orthodox Church in Polish-Lithuanian lands to the Pope in Rome. On a local level, this made Catholicism a tenet of any involvement with the Polish state at any high level. This led to most Cossacks being essentially second-class citizens in that society. This was not a huge issue for many poorer Cossacks, but was a source of discontent for richer ones. Wealthy Cossacks who wished to enter the higher echelons of power within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were now required to Polonize themselves, to abandon their religion and their culture. This combination of discrimination, disenfranchisement, and disillusionment would serve to be a powder keg, one that would explode in 1648. The Khmelnytsky Uprising saw not just Cossacks, but Ruthenians and even Crimean Tatars openly revolt against the Polish crown. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was elected hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and over a 9-year period would drive all Poles out of what is now Ukraine. This uprising is an important part of both Cossack and Ukrainian history for several reasons. Firstly, it tied the Cossack and Ruthenian histories together, both participating against Polish oppression. Some of the arguments that Ukrainian history is Cossack history come from this point in time, and at least in my eyes, bear considerable weight. Modern Ukraine is sometimes cited as having evolved from the Cossack power here. Secondly, the mass killing of Poles, and especially Jews, etched a dark stain in Cossack history. Polish landlords and residents were targeted for their role in attempting to saddle the Cossack horse, but Jews were slaughtered in revenge. Revenge perceived as money men. The Polish crown had, for a long time, farmed out tax collection to its Jewish residents, and this, as it had in many places, built a resentment for the Jews. Whilst the Jews did not themselves directly impoverish the Cossacks, they were acting at the behest of landlords who were, and thus in many Cossack eyes, the Jews were the source of their problems, if not the Polish landlords as well. In future years, many, if not most, pogroms against Jews in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union would be spearheaded by Cossacks and their descendants, to whom the Jew was immortalized as an enemy of the Cossack people. This is something that lingers even today, and mild anti-Semitism is an unfortunate facet of both Russian and Ukrainian life even now. Lastly, the Khmelnytsky Uprising tied the fate of the Cossacks to that of the Russian Empire. From the start of the rebellion, the Cossacks were outnumbered and in numerous battles and failed treaties with the Poles had depleted their numbers. Thus, in addition to Crimean Tatars, who had agreed to aid the Zaporozhians in return for Polish captives, the Zaporozhians themselves reached out to the Tsar of Russia for aid. This culminated in the Treaty of Pereslavl. Under the treaty, the Cossack registry would be transferred to Russia and expanded to include 40,000 Cossacks. Furthermore, the Hetmanate, an autonomous Zaporozhian state separate to Poland and Lithuania, would be put in alliance with Russia. Orthodoxy, under the Patriarch of Constantinople, would be enforced, and Russia would defend the Hetmanate against any enemies. A pretty good deal, right? Not quite. The Russo-Polish War that followed led to the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667. Under this treaty, amongst other things, the Hetmanate of the Zaporozhians was put as jointly under Russian and Polish control, with the former having far more influence than the latter. Under these terms, the Zaporozhians fought for the Russian Tsar, and the surrounding lands that they once held as estates or grazing lands were split between Polish and Russian nobles. Whilst the uprising had not initially been for independence, the oppression of the Poles saw a Cossack state as a popular idea, an idea with lands that was now being split between Poland and Russia. So why did the Zaporozhians accept this? The Cossack population had been decimated in this war and would take years to recover. As such, the Zaporozhians found themselves weaker, more divided, and more directly interfered with than they had been before the war. The uprising had been fraught since its inception, and only through interventions had the Cossacks won. For many, Russia, at least on paper, appeared to be a more benevolent overlord, if indeed they had to have one. The Cossack registry would continue to exist in Poland right up to 1699, though the number of Cossacks on that list grew ever smaller year on year, nearly all enrolling with the Tsar instead. It's important to remember that the Treaty of Pereslavu, in many eyes, was more of an agreement or understanding rather than an official treaty, and there are those who see Russia's encroachment on the Zaporozhian as somewhat of a betrayal. Nonetheless, at least on paper, Russia was a more appealing partner. Russia's control of Cossacks on the Dnieper was not unique. Growing control and influence around the Don and Terek caused many Cossacks there to fall in with Stepan Razin. Stepan was a Don Cossack who, like many Cossacks of the time, made his living from the raiding he inflicted on others. Growing Russian control in the form of the revision of serfdom in 1649 saw the Tsar attempt to restrict the freedom and increase the obligations of the Cossacks in Russia, treating them rather as subjects than mercenaries. Resisting arrest, Stepan raised a large revolt in 1670, joined by many ethnic minorities and peasants. Much like the Cossacks in Ukraine, Stepan Razin and his followers had some initial success, but were outnumbered, and the Russian state ultimately crushed them. The rebellion came to an end the next year, and for the Cossacks this new status was accepted without further bloodshed. It should be noted that this new status of serf was only technically applicable to the Cossacks. The Cossacks not having masters whose estates they worked on and were now bound to. For many Cossacks who lived on the border regions of the growing Tsardom, it was inherently easier to slip to and from places at the best of times, and this growth of state apparatus was still a distant idea. Cossacks and Russians may seem, to the outside observer, ubiquitous, but as we have seen, the relationship between them was anything but harmonious. A number of revolts against Russian rule occurred during the 18th century from multiple Cossack hosts. The Don Cossacks under their ataman Bulavin rose against the government in response to intrusions on the Don territory by the Russian army, who were in search of escaped serfs. Likewise, the Zaporozhian host turned against the Russian crown in 1709, siding with the invading Swedes. Both of these Cossack revolts were crushed by the Russian state, but not wholly. A number of Don Cossacks fled to the Ottoman Empire, or to the Terek, where a growing number of Cossacks were forming a protective barrier to Persian and Ottoman expansion in the Caucasus. Having destroyed the Zaporozhian Sich in 1709, many Zaporozhians retreated over the river to Ottoman protection, only rebuilding their capital 2 years later. As late as 1773, Cossacks were still in revolt against the Russian crown, with many Cossacks from Orenburg following their ataman Pugachev in revolt against the Russian crown. So if the Cossacks were seen as unreliable and revolted so many times, why were they not crushed by the Russian army? It's a good question and with a very simple answer. They couldn't. The Cossacks lived on the edge of the state, far from the Russian interior. This meant that not only was it often difficult and expensive to send the army there, but often it was counterproductive. By living on the borderlands, the Cossacks were the first line of defence, or sometimes offence, against Russia's enemies, and despite their revolts, it was often wiser to leave them be. Cossack loyalty could be bought with autonomy, gold, and religion. And as the Russian state expanded, the relationship between them and the Cossacks began to improve. It should be noted that Tsarist policy was often to bribe many of the atamans, coercing them to be friendly by gifts and grants of land. Originally this was done to secure an oath of loyalty by that ataman, but over time it became quite common for the Tsar to appoint the ataman. As the Tsardom was an Orthodox Slavic nation, who then granted these Cossacks liberties that many of their subjects did not enjoy, the revolts grew less and less, with Cossack involvement in domestic issues growing more and more frequent. The Greben Cossacks, literally Cossacks who row, were a small host that had moved from the Don to the Terek rivers in the 16th century, and had formally swore allegiance to the Tsar in 1717. This was because they themselves were facing pressure from nearby Chechens and Nogai raids. This is at a time that the Russian army and state were beginning to cement themselves in the Caucasus, and thus the two made natural bedfellows. In our previous videos, we have touched upon the Cossack element in the Russian conquest of the Caucasus, but we haven't really explored just how heavy that influence was. The Caucasus would see repeated hosts move to the region to help shore up defences against the mighty Caucasians who lived there. The Agrakhan host, raised out of resettled Don Cossacks, was raised in 1722 in Dagestan. The Terek Cossacks were reinforced with Volga Cossack escapees in 1769, and the Black Sea Cossack host was raised in 1792, numbering 25,000 men. These Cossacks not only provided valuable bodies to help defend against indigenous assaults, but also provided fierce and eager colonists for the region. It might seem strange to hear that many Cossack hosts were resettled in the Caucasus. After all, why would they leave their homes? The answer again is deceptively simple. For most Cossacks, freedom and plunder were the main benefits of their position. They raised what they could from the land and rode out to take what others had grown when times were hard. As the Russian state grew and more contact was made with the nobility and army, the appeal of virgin lands was a strong one. When actively supported by the Tsar, it made sense to many of the atamans and hetmen to move their people away from their traditional rivers further south, seeking greater opportunities. This also moved them away from the suffocating influence of the Russian army, nobility, and Jews. The nature of Cossack society meant that whilst it was nominally equal, there were of course the well-to-dos, who had a larger influence than others, and it only took a few bribes from the Tsar to convince those that the Caucasus region was a better home for their people. But it was not just the Caucasus that the Russian Empire was expanding into. In Astrakhan in 1737, a new host was made out of Christianized Kalmyks and displaced Volga Cossacks, with the aim of securing the fluid Central Asian border. In 1755, the Orenburg host was raised in Siberia, with the Bug host raised 14 years later in Eastern Europe. All of these hosts, nominally loyal to the Tsar and given wide autonomy in their region, helped secure the ever-expanding borders of the empire. The Don and the Dnieper had traditionally been border rivers, but as the state expanded, the Cossacks on each found a new future. An agreement had been made with the Zaporozhians back in 1734, granting their Sich all previously held lands back in return for serving in the Russian army. This had worked quite well, but the Sich continued to be a refuge point for Ukrainian serfs escaping Russian overlordship. In 1774, the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainaka removed the Crimean Khanate as an entity. This meant that the border ceased to exist, and likewise protection for it was no longer needed. In 1762, the Zaporozhian Cossacks had numbered over 33,000 strong. This was an uncomfortably large host to be so near the ever-increasing Russian interior, and now that there was no military need for them, Tsarina Catherine the Great ordered the destruction of the Zaporozhian host. Many of the Zaporozhian elite were embedded in Russian society, and had been since the turn of the century. Thus their loyalty was largely with the hands that fed them, not their roots. In 1775, backed with 65,000 Russian soldiers, the Zaporozhians were disbanded. Surprisingly, this was actually mostly peaceful. Many Cossacks simply enlisted into the Hussar and Dragoon regiments of Russia, who were always eager for capable riders. A considerable number did flee south, however, and went to give up their way of life for a stable income. They established the Danube Sich in the Ottoman Empire instead. It should be noted that in some Ukrainian sources, the disbandment of the Zaporozhian was as much as to remove a military threat as it was to destroy the idea of Ukrainian nationhood. This theory does bear a bit of weight when we consider what happened to the Don Cossacks. The Don Cossacks too were located near the heart of Russia, but they were not disbanded. The Don Cossacks had been a part of Muscovite history since its earliest days, and spoke the same language as the Russians did. Despite occasional raids and rebellions, the last in 1707, for which their land was annexed, the Don Cossacks were largely seen as more reliable and more Russian Cossacks. After the Bulavin Uprising, all atamans were appointed by the Tsar, and their land incorporated into other Russian provinces. Yet by 1786, in reward for their loyalty and subservience to the state, the Don Cossacks were rewarded with their lands back, the lands of the Don Wojska. It should be noted, however, that of the Zaporozhians who did enlist with the Hussar and Dragoon regiments, they did not just forget their history. As Russia went to war with the Muslim Ottomans in 1828, those on the Danube were convinced by Russian generals to switch sides, helping to trounce the Turks, but unable to realistically return to their lands. Those Zaporozhians of the Danube were offered a new land to settle, one far from the strong arm of the Russian state. The Kuban River, reforged as the Black Sea Cossack host, these Cossacks would go on to campaign against both Poland and Persia, as well as the indigenous Caucasians of the Kuban region. Whether by hook or by crook, the Cossacks were now an integral part of the Russian army and state, and they were used as such. In 1808, the Siberian Cossack host was officially raised, numbering 6,000 men who could enforce the Tsar's will in the distant east of the country. This is an interesting side note, as before this, Cossacks had primarily been used in Europe. The Russian population had now grown in Siberia large enough to warrant a loyalist bloc being put there. As they had been used throughout previous centuries, peasant unrest and native resistance were met with ferocious Cossacks, who were given full rein to end the disturbance however they deemed fit. With their expansion across Asia, the indigenous people of Siberia were included in the Cossack expansion. In 1851, a Russo-Buryat host was raised in the Trans-Baikal region, with a splinter host settling along the Amur 9 years later. These hosts proved to be beacons of Tsarist oppression in what were relatively free areas of the empire. But it wasn't just east the empire was expanding. As the Central Asian Khanates were brought to heel, more Cossacks were required to secure such temporal holdings, and in 1867, the Semirechynskoye host was raised from amongst the Orenburg and Siberian Cossacks and sent south. It should be noted that this, like the Siberian hosts, was a mixed force, with many Kazakhs, Turkmen and Kyrgyz in its ranks alongside the Slavic Ukrainians and Russians. Cossacks within Russia had a reputation as wild, ferocious men, but soon the rest of the world would learn about them. The defeat of Napoleon in Russia saw thousands of Cossacks from several hosts riding hard across Europe to harry Le Grand Armée as they retreated back to France. For the first time, Western Europe would know these wild riders, armed with rifles and lances, who would appear from the snow in devastating charges. In the popular image of the time, the Cossacks were painted as rugged and heroic saviours of Europe from the French blight, but this was not universally recognised. Poles and Jews especially saw horrible acts committed on them as Cossack rosters passed through their villages. At a time where stricter regulations and restraint were starting to be seen in European armies, the Cossacks acted like a relic, plundering and murdering unmolested. Yet a relic they were not, and part of the intimidation of the Russian Empire in the 19th century rested on the fact that they could unleash such wild and savage horsemen into the centre of Europe. Yet as the Russian state expanded, where they met the most resistance and had the biggest concentration of Cossack hosts was in the Caucasus region. As we have learned, Cossacks had been present in the region since the 16th century, but as Russia expanded, there was a greater need for troops both familiar with guerrilla fighting as well as more capable without huge state investment. The Russian state had been invading the Caucasus since about the 17th century, but began to actively annex and consolidate lands with settlers from 1800 onward. The shift of the border ever southward led to multiple hosts being resettled in Tsarist hopes to secure an ever-expanding frontier. The role Cossacks played in the conquest of the Caucasus cannot be understated. Cossacks were the first line of defence against any indigenous resistance, and served to harry, raid and spy on the various Caucasian tribes. The Cossacks of the Terek and the Don had adopted the fashion and habits of the Caucasians, and thus were acclimatised to both the terrain and strategies of the natives. This was in sharp contrast to the Russian army, who were often outfoxed by the natives of the region. Territory annexed from the various peoples of the Caucasus was given over to Cossack hosts to settle with their own men, thus providing an economic incentive for many young Cossacks to fight for the Tsar. Indeed, right up to the 1920s, the entire south of Russia was dominated by Cossack settlements, a legacy of this annexation. In 1832, two new hosts were raised. The Azov host, made primarily from Danubian Zaporozhian Cossacks who had accepted Russian rule, and the Caucasian Cossack host, which was made of a patchwork of different hosts, including Terek, Black Sea and Volga. By 1860, enough ground had been captured to warrant revision, and the Caucasian host was divided between the Terek host and the Black Sea host. The latter relocated to the Kuban River. 4 years later, the Black Sea and Azov hosts would merge together into the Kuban Cossack host. It is worth reflecting on just how much the Cossacks had changed from even a century ago, now being moved and relocated at the whims of a once foreign ruler. Yet Cossacks still held a privileged position in Russian society, and by the close of the century, there were over 2.5 million registered Cossacks, with women making up 1.3 million of that number. The usefulness of having a self-sufficient, military-capable and dependable force was not lost on Russia's neighbours, and in 1897 the Shah of Persia requested Cossack advisors to help him raise his own Cossack brigade. I mentioned earlier on that Cossacks at the time of Napoleon's invasion came across as something of a relic, and that is partly true. Warfare was changing rapidly, and the time of the Cossack was drawing to an end. Yet in some eyes, the dawn of the 20th century was indeed the zenith of Cossackdom. Holding a place above natives, the peasantry, Jews and national minorities, the Cossacks played important roles in keeping the Tsardom together. In 1900, Amur Cossacks helped put down the Boxer Rebellion in China, and right up to the start of the First World War, numerous revolts were suppressed with the help of Cossacks. Cossack influence in the Russian state was very strong, so much so that in 1909 they successfully petitioned for the terms of their service to be reduced from 25 to just 18 years. With the start of the First World War, thousands of Cossacks were called to fight. Serving as outriders, messengers and as cavalry, they met their deaths in the face of mechanized warfare. Machine guns, long-distance artillery and nerve agents were all encountered by the Cossacks who, for most of living memory, had dealt only with scythe-armed peasants or the breech-loading rifles of the Caucasians. As the tide turned and the Central Powers began to march deep into Ukraine, alarm set in. The abdication of the Tsar, followed by the Bolshevik coup, made the terms very stark for the Cossacks. The Bolsheviks were proposing that the Cossacks would step down from their lofty position and stand side by side with the peasantry and national minorities, even Jews, all at the expense of their land being given away to the Germans. As such, nearly all Cossacks joined into the anti-Bolshevik White cause, at least at first. Led by famed Tsarist generals, with whom much of the upper echelons of Cossack society were familiar with, such as Kornilov, Kolchak, and Mamontov, Cossacks rode out against Soviets that were popping up across the country. On the Terek and in the south of Russia particularly, the Cossacks had a firm grasp for much of the Civil War, able to suppress both peasants and indigenous groups in a semblance of the old order. In Ukraine, where much of Cossackdom had roots, over 60,000 men rose up to oppose the Soviet ideology that was encroaching there. Along the train lines of the Trans-Baikal, Cossacks under Semyonov plundered and pillaged at will, supported by Japanese and Anglo-American backers, as a bulwark against Sovietism. Yet Cossack society was not an equal one. In 1916, there had been 176,000 Siberian Cossacks, and the Russian Civil War split them apart. Thousands threw in their lot with the Red Cause, with the Bolsheviks actually raising their own Red Cossack host in 1918. It should be noted that even in times of peace, the Cossacks were notorious for targeting Jewish settlements, but this was dialed up to 11 during the Civil War. Pogroms on a systematic and brutal scale occurred, causing upward of 100,000 Jewish deaths, with many more fleeing westward. While some Cossacks did indeed defect to the Bolsheviks, the majority remained anti-Bolshevik in their stance. Naturally, they made up large chunks of the white military. When the Bolsheviks began to win, they turned their eyes to the old arm of the Tsarist state, to the Cossacks. De-Cossacization was a process of removing the trappings, influence and identity of the Cossack people in a systematic way to render them amenable to the Soviet state. In reality, this was a genocide, targeting a specific group and removing them as a perceived threat. The fact that Cossacks had had a privileged position in the old regime, holding land, wealth, and influence, was also damning in many Soviet eyes. Out of a population of around 3 million, anywhere from 200 to 700,000 Cossacks were murdered, starved, or deported from their homelands. This was systematic, with every host being broken up and their lands being distributed. Cossack ranks and customs were banned. By 1920, the writing was on the wall, and many Cossacks attempted to leave voluntarily rather than fight a losing battle. Many Cossacks of Terek, Don, and Kuban ancestry were among those who evacuated from Crimea. Landing in Tunisia, then a French protectorate, many travelled onwards to France, Canada, and the United States, where their descendants reside today. The Semirochnaya Cossacks of Central Asia fled to China that year as well, followed by the Amur Cossacks 4 years later, who had initially aided the Soviets. Some of these Cossacks travelled onwards to Australia, New Zealand, and South America, creating communities there, but others remained in China, making a considerable contribution to the Russian population of northern China's Harbin. While some Cossacks had managed to escape the Soviet Union, the majority were stuck there, but a large portion did not want to flee. This was their home, where their ancestors had lived, and even in the new regime, many eked out their existence. It is worth noting that in Ukraine, the Cossack legacy is a little bit more complicated. As the Zaporozhians had moved away from their ancestral lands, there was no authentic Cossack force that remained in the area to serve as a counter to Bolshevism. Yet the history of Ukraine and Cossacks are intertwined. Without the trappings and titles of the Tsar, many of the Ukrainian people identified with those Cossack origins and felt a continuation in the contemporary Cossack form. The early Ukrainian state's claims were extensive, pretty much covering everywhere Cossacks had settled in the south. To many Ukrainians, Cossack is not an ethnic group at all, but rather a status, one that their ancestors held both during and even before Tsarist rule. Perhaps then, this is one of the reasons the Ukrainians were targeted by the Soviet state. Both in the 1920s and in the 1930s, the Soviet Union experienced famine, made through a combination of bad weather, limited state assistance, and targeted requisitions. Thousands of Cossacks perished as their produce was seized by Red Army soldiers. The interwar years were very hard for the Cossack people. Discriminated against by the state, disenfranchised, and scattered across much of the Union, Cossacks were seen as kulaks by another name and treated with disdain. Many shed this identity, adopting Soviet Russian or Ukrainian identities instead, and reaping the social benefits. By 1936, memories of Cossack power before the Civil War were beginning to dim, and some restrictions that had been placed on them by the Soviets were lifted. This was especially true of the army. Those who claimed this status, including the Red Cossacks, who had been formed in the Civil War, were merged into regular cavalry units. With the start of the Second World War and Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, a great division occurred. For some Cossacks, the Soviet state was their enemy, the Soviets having liquidated them as a people and actively collaborated with the invaders in occupied territory. Yet for many more, the Soviet Union was their home and they were willing to defend it with their lives. Even more Cossacks served in the Red Army, helping to defeat fascism in their former strongholds. Yet despite this mixed response, the Cossacks were not collectively punished, even though other ethnic groups such as the Chechens had had a similar incident during the war. Perhaps it was due to the Slavic nature of this ethnic group that this collective punishment was not assigned. Instead, the population was not fully rehabilitated. In the eyes of the Soviet state, the Cossacks were not a people, but rather a class, much like kulak, that no longer existed in their system. Thus, their punishments were particular rather than broad, and those Cossacks who had aided the invader or simply been living in northern China in the 1940s were rounded up and sent to the gulags, where thousands would die. Even Cossacks who had ridden as far as France and surrendered to Allied forces were repatriated to the Soviet Union, despite British promises not to do exactly that. Yet the majority of Cossacks had fought for the Red Army and were treated as heroes. The death of Stalin saw huge changes in the Soviet Union, and so too for the Cossacks. Those in the gulags were permitted to resettle in Russia proper, specifically along the Don and Kuban rivers, epicenters of Cossack culture. The image of the Cossacks was rehabilitated slowly over time through the arts and media. Films, songs, and books about them were being steadily published throughout the 1970s and 80s. The image of Cossacks had been so much rehabilitated that when the Sino-Soviet split occurred in 1961, many Russians who were living in China, the descendants of Cossacks, actually repatriated back to the Soviet Union and were welcomed with open arms. Despite being the wild arm of the Tsarist state, Cossacks were now adopted in the Slavic nations of the Union as ancestors, remnants of a heritage lost to modernity. Yet with the fall of the Soviet Union, many of those same people began to float the idea of their own Cossack heritage. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, thousands of people claimed heritage from the various Cossack hosts, as more awareness and publicity was put on it. In 1995, the federal government of Russia created an official Cossack registry, with Ukraine passing a similar law in 2002. These registries were largely ceremonial, but they did provide an important link to those seeking their Cossack heritage and acceptance by the state. Registries do not exist in Belarus or Kazakhstan, but Cossack associations do. Since the outbreak of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, Cossacks have been present on both sides in various military capacities. Dating back to the first violence in 2014, hundreds of self-proclaimed Cossacks have died fighting in and around the Donbass region. Whilst the global Cossack community does appear to be growing, there is still an ongoing question about whether they constitute an ethnic group. After all, they don't have their own language, religion, culture, or homeland. To what degree is this a heritage as opposed to a living, breathing ethnic group? In my eyes, the hundreds of thousands of people who identify as Cossacks have bothered to relearn ancient traditions and practice a way of life stand as testament that this is indeed a living, breathing ethnic group. What is interesting is, despite historically there being a variety of faith systems amongst the various Cossack hosts, all Cossacks today are primarily Orthodox. This is in part due to geography, with most Russian Cossacks coming from the south, where the Don, Terek and Kuban hosts resided, rather than the east. Until recently, Ukrainian Cossacks also followed the Russian Orthodox Church, but now largely follow the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for obvious reasons. Cossack clothing is easily identifiable and borrows heavily from the Caucasus, a legacy of the Terek Cossacks who lived in the region. Despite original Cossacks having a more Oriental Turkish approach to garments, the regulations and reforms of the 19th century cemented what we now consider the classic Cossack look. These consist of a furred hat called a papaka, with a beshmet or tunic worn around the chest. The chekmat, a kaftan for men, is worn with wide Turkish-style pantaloons called sharovari. A cherkeska or Circassian-style robes is often worn as well, with a few regional variations based on the host's colour and history, such as the burqa worn by the Terek Cossacks. Distinctively, many Cossacks, especially those of Zaporizhian legacy, would wear their hair in an unusual style, shaved with a tuft left. Whilst this haircut is associated with Ukraine and the Zaporizhian Cossacks, it is thought to actually be a Polish style of haircut, originally deriving from the Wends of the 11th century. The haircut, called an oselodets or herring in Ukrainian, was banned in Stalin's time. This design in Russian is called a chochol or tuft, and is often used as a slur against Ukrainian people. Cossack clothing today is based on these 19th century regulations, and much of the individualism and personal heritage of various groups has now been lost. Nowadays, you will see these outfits at festivals and events in Russia, as well worn by those acting in a military capacity or on parade. As mentioned earlier, modern Cossacks adhere to Christianity, Orthodoxy particularly. As such, Cossack festivals and holidays follow the Orthodox calendar. Nevertheless, there is one festival that is uniquely Cossack in origin. The Shurmitsi is an initiation for a man or historically a boy, to become a fully fledged Cossack in the Cossack community. These are essentially martial sporting events and see a variety of skills demonstrated: riding, sword fighting and shooting. Nowadays these are mini festivals and many non-Cossack Russians attend to see displays of these feats. The cultural legacy of the Cossacks is incredibly strong, so much so that many of the things we think of as Russian or Ukrainian are actually originally from the Cossacks. The famed Ukrainian dance the Hopak is actually Cossack in its origins. Similarly, the Russian Kazachok is of Cossack heritage as well. From a culinary point of view, many dishes of both Russia and Ukraine are shared with the Cossacks. Borscht, shashlik and irian are all common Slavic foods that originate from the Cossacks, with nardek, a honey derived from watermelon eaten with fried donuts, a uniquely Cossack dessert. This is often washed down with wine, which was the drink of choice historically for many Cossack hosts, particularly those in the south. To summarise, the Cossacks are both a relic from the past and a sign of the future. Since nationalism ended the Soviet Union, more and more people are stepping forward to claim this rich cultural heritage. Songs, outfits and lifestyles are being readopted by many, finding their Cossack heritage both within and outside Russia. Cossackdom forms an integral part of the modern identities of both Russia and Ukraine, and it is very clear there is a rift in the Cossack community due to the Russian invasion. Nevertheless, the support for their culture and their traditions is strong on both sides. I do believe in the future more and more people will step forward to take up the Cossack mantle. My name is Andrew, and thank you for watching. Up next are the Crimean Tatars. Paka!